Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we're reading Swamp Thing number 131. And just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last couple of issues, Swamp Thing has been poisoned, and he was poisoned in New Jersey. So he's been trying to get back to home. He can't go through the green because of the poisoning. So he is slowly walking all the way from New Jersey to Louisiana. And also because of the poisoning, he's been having hallucinations of important people in his life kind of taunting him like they're his inner demons, basically. And that ended with him being hit by a truck that he thought was Anton Arcane. And that injured his body so badly that he was left crawling to Louisiana with only his arms pulling his torso. And then he passed out from the trauma. And at the very end of the last issue, his body was found by some interesting folk. We don't know exactly who they are, but they got pointy ears, they got interesting eyes, but they look kind of humanoid. Oh, and also Swamp Thing made a double to replace him so that Abby wouldn't know he was gone to New Jersey. And that double has fallen in love with his family. So his wife, Abby, is thinking it is the greatest time of all for them. They have a great relationship, but she doesn't know that the Swamp Thing, who's been so great recently, is actually a double and not the Swamp Thing that she married. So that's where we left off with the last issue. So first things first, with issue 131, we got the cover here. We see Swamp Thing is standing amongst a bunch of candles that are lit. There's some people around him. It looks like there's spells going on, like magic is coming up. There's a six-sided star with a circle around it that it's kind of overlain over Swamp Thing's body, like something magical is definitely happening. And then there's also like Nordic runes written on top and bottom. And we see that this issue is written by Nancy Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Kim DeMolder. And we start off on the first page with Swamp Thing in a room. We can hear some people talking, and one of them is saying, "What is it?" And another says, "It's an Earl King. At least that's what Auntie Maeve says." And the first person says, "An Earl King? A real one? Is she sure? I've heard of such creatures, but I thought they were just stories. Auntie Maeve is the eldest of the folk. She came here when the folk first fled the old country. If she says it's an Earl King, it must be one." And with these voices being so close to Swamp Thing, he begins to wake up, and as his eyes slowly begin to open and focus, he thinks to himself, "Where am I?" And then he sees a woman sitting over him, but she's kind of not really defined, and he thinks, "Abby?" But as we turn the page, we see that it is definitely not Abby. The two people in the room who were talking earlier are standing at the foot of his bed. There is a man and a woman. Both are dressed like they are going to a Ren fair, and they don't look like they're human. They have long pointy ears and cat's eyes, and the man actually has ram's horns growing out of his forehead. And we see the name of this issue is Folk Remedy. So these two see Swamp Thing is waking up, and the woman says, "Colm, he's awake. Fetch Auntie Maeve." Then as Colm leaves to go get Auntie Maeve, the woman walks over to Swamp Thing with a wet sponge, like she's going to sponge his head off, and she says, There, Earl King. Auntie Maeve will be right with you." And I should mention something about the art changes right here, where before they were wearing like Renaissance gear and stuff, but now that Swamp Thing is fully awake looking at her, she's just wearing like a normal dress. And then when Colm returns, we see he is just wearing overalls and not what he was wearing before, and he doesn't have the horns on his head. So either that was like a vision that Swamp Thing was just imposing on them, or he was seeing their true selves, possibly. So like I said, Colm returns with Auntie Maeve, and when Auntie Maeve sees Swamp Thing, she says, "So, you're finally awake, Lord of the Green." And as she moves to sit down next to him, Swamp Thing sits up and asks, "Well, where am I?" And Auntie Maeve answers, "You're in Danu's Holler, if that means anything." Then Swamp Thing rubs his head and says, "The last thing I remember, I was hit by a truck." And then Auntie Maeve begins smoking, and she says, "You were sure enough in a sorry state when Colm and the others found you. You ain't the first stranger to find his way into the Holler by accident, but you're the first Earl King I've seen in these parts." And Swamp Thing's kind of shocked at her knowledge, and he says, "You know what I am?" And Auntie Maeve responds, "Lord and lady's sakes, of course I do. As you've no doubt noticed, we here in the Holler ain't your typical hillbillies. We call ourselves the Folk. That's always been our name. But the humans, those in the old country at least, knew us as Tuatha de Da'anan, the children of Danu." Then we get a flash of what the old country looked like back in the day. And kind of like I said earlier, it's basically like a Ren Fair. We see a bunch of people crowding around different booths, and they're looking at weapons, or they're looking at ale and drink and food. And Auntie Maeve narrates, "Our race is older and wiser than that of man. The folks were the first to master the smith and the working of wood. Our people were warriors, huntsmen, poets, sorcerers, physicians, and musicians without equal." Then as we turn the page, we see there are two warriors who are brandishing weapons, and Maeve continues, "Our leaders were heroes of great strength and courage, such as Nuada of the Silver Arm and Lug of the Many Skills. They were good and just rulers. Ours were the old ways, the ways of harvest and planting. We worshipped the goddess Danu, she of the moon's cycle and grace." And under that narration, we see some people standing under moonlight. They're kind of in silhouette, though, so we can't see what they're doing. But there's one standing in the moonlight that's got a robe on. They also have a dagger and a headdress. And they look like they're about to do some magic, because in front of that person on the ground is another person who looks like they've been stabbed a couple times by the priest in the moonlight. And Maeve's narration continues, "We believed ourselves to be blessed, and we became cruel and arrogant towards those we considered our inferiors. This would prove to be the folks' undoing. At first, the humans treated us with reverence and awe, but in time their awe grew into mistrust, which quickly soured into hatred and fear. When the carpenter's religion came into the old country, we did not pay it much heed. It had nothing to do with us, and then it all came tumbling down." And under this narration, we see panels of humans on the ground looking up at the folk riding on horseback, and then we see humans attacking them with weapons made of stone. I will say the art makes it look like these are cavemen almost, but she mentions the carpenter's religion, who she's referring to Jesus, so that would mean that this has to be somewhere after the fall of Rome in the darker Middle Ages. But either way, as we turn the page, we see the folk are fleeing their burning houses and cities, and Maeve's narration continues. "The folk were scattered to the winds, their villages pillaged, their pride destroyed. The folk continued, but from then on we lived apart from humankind, secreting ourselves in isolated valleys and on distant mountain tops. But no matter how well we hid ourselves, no matter how quietly we tried to lead our lives, the humans would always find us out." And under that narration, we're seeing humans burning a bunch of folk at the stake. And Maeve's narration continues. 300 years ago, the last of the folk chartered a ship to the New World, hoping they could begin afresh. I was but a wee thing at the time, yet I still can recall the sense of loss as we left the old country, and the surge of hope when we first laid eyes on the new one. We settled in this valley because it reminded us of the place we had left behind, and because it's home to natural energy, what humans call magic. For 3 centuries, the folk have lived in the holler. We keep to ourselves, and we only venture out into the world of men when it's unavoidable. There aren't many of us. Within a century or 5, there won't be any folk left at all, I reckon. We are a dying breed." In the panels underneath the last part of the narration, we just see the folk arriving to America, and then them finding a place to settle, and then them walking through a human town, and people are closing their doors to them and pointing at them from afar. And as Aunt Maeve finishes her story, Swamp Thing says, "I'm sorry." And Aunt Maeve replies, "There's no need you should be, Girl King. All things have their season, as you well know. The folk had their time, just as the humans do now. But that's enough about me and mine. How is it you became to be in this dreadful mess?" So Swamp Thing recounts to her, saying, "I was summoned by the Green to deliver it from a grave wounding. The thing I battled was a hapless creation of man's greed and thoughtlessness, and in the end, it was destroyed by those responsible for its blighted existence. I was left trying to realign the ecosystem the beast and his masters had endangered. Unfortunately, in doing so, I became so tainted by toxic waste, I could not enter the Green without risking its integrity. I have been forced to trek back to my home in the bayous of Louisiana on foot, all while suffering the effects of having absorbed so many toxins into my system." And Aunt Maeve says to him, "It's a good thing Colm and Nain ran across you when they did, Earl King. If you don't receive the proper help, you're going to die right soon." And Swamp Thing seems a little shocked by that, and then he says to her, "No, I cannot die. I am an elemental." And then she walks over to him and pokes him in the chest and says, "All things have their season. Believe me, Earl Kings can die. And Swamp Thing doesn't really pay attention to that. He just kind of sits up and tries to get out of bed saying, "You don't understand. I have to get back to my wife, my child." And as of yet, Swamp Thing has been covered by a bunch of blankets, so we haven't seen what his body actually looks like. So Swamp Thing sits up and looks like he's going to try to get out of the bed. Maeve walks to his side and says, "You're not going anywhere, Earl King, at least not yet." And Swamp Thing asks, "What do you mean?" And then Aunt Maeve grabs the blanket and pulls it off of his legs and lower torso, and she says, "See for yourself." And Swamp Thing looks down and he sees he's not going anywhere. Basically, his lower half is completely melted away, except for a little bit of his spine is attached to some really scrawny legs. And there's some pieces of organs that I guess haven't fully dissolved, but they are dangling out, hanging from bits of tissue. And Swamp Thing asks, What's wrong with me?" And Aunt Maeve sits down in a rocking chair next to his bed and says, "Judging from what you've told me, I say you've exhausted your body's ability to regenerate properly. I can help your body heal itself. However, it's been a long time since I've had to use the old ways for anything more serious than weather witching. I can't guarantee whether you'll approve of the end results." And Swamp Thing says, "I don't see where I have much choice." So as we turn the page, we see Nain and Calm are helping Swamp Thing out of his bed. They were the two from the beginning of the comic who were at his bedside earlier. And as Nain walks in, she says, "How are you feeling, Earl King?" And as Calm helps Swamp Thing walk out of the bed, he says, "Embarrassed. I am not used to being so helpless." And Nain walks over to him and goes to his other side, and they both help him walk over to the ceremony area where we see a symbol painted on the ground like a big circle with a six-sided star and a bunch of other magical symbols painted in it. And then Calm and Nain lay Swamp Thing down in the center of the circle, and Calm says, "There's nothing to be ashamed of, your lordship. One of our greatest hero kings, Nuada, only had one arm." But before Swamp Thing can respond, he is laid down in the center, and Auntie Maeve comes out of a very smoky area. So I don't know if it's mist that she's creating, or if she was burning some herbs for the ceremony, or if it's just for a cool effect. But she is wearing a bunch of ceremonial garb. She's wearing a cloak and a headdress that look like they're made from deer skin. And the headdress that's resting on her head is definitely the top of a deer's actual head because it has antlers coming out of it, and you can see where the deer's eyes were. And then she's holding some sort of stick that looks like a wishbone, and also a plant that looks kind of like mistletoe, where it's got green leaves and red berries in it. So as she appears in the room, she says, "No more talking. The ritual is about to begin. Calm, Nain, take your places." And we see Nain grab a pan flute, and Calm sits down on the ground, and he's got a drum in his lap. And there's a table next to him that has a bowl with water in it, and Maeve walks over to that bowl and puts the mistletoe in it and soaks the leaves. And then she walks over to Swamp Thing and begins to splash Swamp Thing with the water from that branch. And with that, the spell begins. We see wind whirling around Maeve, and she raises her hands up, and there's yellow magic coming out of the wishbone stick. And it looks like she's saying some kind of incantation, but we don't see any of this. This is all just pictures. And she goes over to Swamp Thing, kneeling in the center of the circle with that wishbone stick, and touches his forehead. And the second it does, Swamp Thing leans forward like he's in pain and says, "Ugh." And then we get a panel of Maeve and Calm watching this, and they stopped playing the music because Swamp Thing's yelling out, and Aunt Maeve yells at them saying, "Keep playing." So they begin to play again, and underneath their playing, we can definitely hear Swamp Thing crying out, "Ugh! Ugh!" And as we turn the page, we see what is causing his pain. His body is going through some type of transformation. We see his limbs are growing back and getting stronger. We see spikes growing out of his arms and legs and back. And his narration says, "The power that flows through me is ancient, almost as old as that of the Parliament. For the first time since my brush with Sunderland's toxic monster, I feel my vitality return. The magic of the folk surges through every fiber of my being. I let it enter me, reshaping me as it will. I am too weak to do otherwise." And we get glimpses of Swamp Thing's new body as he stands up tall, and it seems like the spell has worked because as he stands, Maeve yells out, "Danu be praised! The Earth King is healed!" And as we turn the page, we get a full page splash of Swamp Thing's new body. He looks super buff as always, but now, like I said, he's got spikes all going up the backside of his arms and also running along his back and shoulders. And then he's got vines on his head that have grown out, and basically it just looks like he's got really long hair. And just a fun fact here, I have been told that this is called the grunge Swamp Thing because this was the 90s, and DC probably wanted to make him cool and hip with the kids. So they gave Swamp Thing a new body that kind of makes him look like he belongs in either Judas Priest with his spikes or Alice in Chains with his hair. But either way, he's a very imposing figure now. He looks like his body could do some damage for sure. So now that Swamp Thing has his new body, we turn the page and we see that Swamp Thing is being led to the edge of the area where the folk live, and Nain, Colm, and Aunt Maeve are saying goodbye to him, and Aunt Maeve is saying, "I wish you well on your journey, Earl King. Mind you now, the magic has reworked you in its way, and it may be some time before you regain your former shape." And Swamp Thing replies to her, "I understand. Now that my system is purged of the toxins, I will be back home in no time." And then Aunt Maeve takes him by the hands and says, "It does my old heart good to know that the lords of creation still walk the land, and that the old ways still work in this world of mankind's making." And Swamp Thing says to her, "Maeve, I owe the folk my life. If there is any boon I can grant you." But he's cut off by Maeve, who says, "It's enough that the young ones have had a chance to see a true Earl King. Now they know that my stories of the old country and the old ways are not just the ramblings of a feeble old woman. May the blessings of Danu be with you, Earl King." And as Swamp Thing is about to leave his body to travel through the green back to Terrebonne Parish, he says to Maeve, "Farewell, my friend." Then we cut to somewhere in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, and it seems all quiet at first, but then Swamp Thing in his new body bursts out from below the water, and he looks around and he sees alligators and turtles and stuff, and he thinks to himself, "Home. I'm finally home. It is good to be back. I had feared I would never see the swamps that birthed me ever again. It is as though a part of me has been restored." And as he walks around the swamp, kind of looking at the plant life and being very happy, he looks up and he sees the rooftop of his house, and he thinks, "Abby, I never meant to be gone so long. No doubt my double has long since disincorporated. She knows I did not keep my promise to her. Once I explain the whole situation, I know she'll understand. After all, we love each other." So Swamp Thing walks back towards his house, and as he does that, he just happens to come upon LeBeau, their Cajun friend who appears from time to time. And LeBeau is out in the swamp just digging for roots and vegetables, and he's singing to himself, and he hears a noise, and he says, "What? Who goes there?" And as he turns, he sees Swamp Thing, but Swamp Thing is in his new body with the spikes and the long hair, and he doesn't quite look like himself. I should also say his body looks less green and is a lot more gray. And Swamp Thing stops and looks at LeBeau and says, "LeBeau." And he reaches out a hand to him, and LeBeau just looks in terror and says, "Que diable, un monstre," which I believe from my crappy translation skills means, "What the devil, a monster." So as LeBeau runs away, Swamp Thing calls out to him, "LeBeau, come back. It's only me, Bon Gumbo," which is the name the Cajuns give Swamp Thing. So since LeBeau ran away, Swamp Thing turns back to his house, but he's thinking, strange. And then we get to outside Swamp Thing's house, where Tefe is swinging on her swing set, and she stops as she hears someone say, "Tefe." And when she looks over, she sees Swamp Thing in his new body kneeling down with his arms wide open like he's going to give her a hug, and he's saying, "Tefe, come give Daddy a big kiss hello." And then Tefe doesn't move at all. She just looks kind of scared at him, and then Swamp Thing says, "Where's Mommy?" And then Tefe runs away back into the house as quickly as she can, and Swamp Thing stands up, and he kind of doesn't understand what's going on, and as Tefe runs away, he says, "Tefe." Then we get to Abby, and she is outside hanging clothes on a clothesline, and she's singing away and not really paying attention, and the returned Swamp Thing comes up behind her and puts a hand on her shoulder and says, "Abby." And then Abby says, and then begins to turn around, and as she does, she's saying, "I thought we could take the baby out on a picnic today." But she stops dead as she turns around and sees Swamp Thing with his new body, and she's staring at him horrified, and he's saying, "Is something wrong?" And then he grabs her hand, and then she instantly freaks out and says, "Let go of me." But Swamp Thing doesn't, and he just says, Abby, don't you recognize me?" And as Abby struggles to pull her arm away, she calls out, "Alec! And then we cut to the doppelganger Swamp Thing, who was just peacefully hanging out by himself, and he hears Abby's screams, and he takes off running back to the house. Then we cut to inside the house and we see Tefe is pulling at Lady Jane's hem and she's saying, "Lady, lady." And Lady Jane looks down and says, "Yes, dear, what is it?" And Tefe turns and points back outside and says, "There's a strange daddy looking for mommy." And upon hearing this, Lady Jane gets very alarmed and she grabs Tefe's hand and runs outside saying, "Hurry, Tefe, show me where he is." Then we cut back to Abby and Swamp Thing has not let her go. He's just pulling her forward to him and he's saying, "Abby, it's me." But Abby yells at him, "Leave me alone." And then Swamp Thing grabs her by the shoulders and says, "I realize I look a little different." But Abby cuts him off yelling again, "Alec!" And as Swamp Thing tries to respond to that, all of a sudden, we see the hand of Swamp Thing's old body punch through his new body's chest, and this is the doppelganger. The double has come to save Abby, the woman he has grown to love over the whole time Swamp Thing's been gone. So as Swamp Thing's new body kind of doubles over in pain, the double grabs Abby and pulls her close and says, "Did it hurt you?" And Abby clings to him saying, "No, I don't think so." And then she begins to cry and says, "It must be one of Uncle Anton's horrible unmen." And just as she says that, the real Swamp Thing begins to stand up and he says, "Abby, I'm not one of your uncle's synthetic monsters. I'm your husband." And Abby replies, "No, that's impossible. Alec hasn't left my side." And then Swamp Thing points to the double and says, "I was called away by the Green 2 weeks ago, but before I left, I grew a second body and commanded it to stay with you and the baby." And then Abby turns to the double and says, "Alec, is this true?" And the doppelganger Swamp Thing gets super pissed and he says, "Don't listen to this creature. You're my wife." And then as we turn to the last page, we see Lady Jane and Tefe running up as Abby is fallen to the ground in shock as the two Swamp Things square off to one another like they're about to fight. But that is the end of the issue, so we'll have to wait until next issue to see what happens. But if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.